and welcome to tonight's webinar. My name is Jennifer Springer, and I'm with the Center for Teaching and Learning, and we're thrilled to help support the SHS webinar this evening. Very brief housekeeping items to cover before I pass it over. You want to remember that the webinar is being recorded, and we will put it on our CTL LibGuides webinar page. We encourage you to ask questions and have conversations in the chat. And we have some wonderful student and NCU alumni moderators tonight. And with that said, I'm passing the introduction over to tonight's webinar to Deborah Illig.
Thank you, Jen. Good evening, everyone. Very excited to have all of you join us for this evening's presentation. The title is that of the role of neuroscientific research on religion, interprofessional implications. Our presenter this evening is Mr. John Balch. John Balch utilizes tools drawn from computational social science and the cognitive sciences to analyze the evolution of religious ideologies over time, particularly as individuals respond to the challenges posed by climate change. He is a doctoral candidate in religion at Boston University and a Lindemood Fellow at the Center for Mind and Culture in Boston, Mass. John is currently working with Dr. Patrick McNamara on the John Templeton Foundation Project for the Cognitive Neuroscience of Religious Cognition. This project is first of its kind to fund a large stream of focused neuroscientific research on religion coordinated across multiple labs. At NCU, this project will be investigating the relationship between dreaming and religious cognition using cutting-edge EEG technology that enables data collection in a naturalistic setting. Before I turn it over to John, I also want to give a shout out for our June session, where we will hear from Dr. Brenda Marshall in collaboration with Veronica Shake and Deborah Chambers, and they will continue the dialogue from a session earlier this year in January pertaining to publishing opportunities and the supportive processes for those work products. So with that, I'll turn it over to you, John. Welcome so very much.
Yeah, thank you guys so much for having me. Let me just go ahead and share my presentation, get that out of the way. All right, is that good for everyone? Okay, yeah, so I'm here to talk about this project that we're doing here at NCU. As was just mentioned, this is sort of one of the first major efforts to fund active research in the cognitive neuroscience of religion. There's been a lot of research in the past. I'm going to talk about that a little bit. But for the most part, most research in this area has been done on top of other grants. It's been done kind of, someone got a big grant to do this big fMRI study, and they kind of tack studying religion onto it. So this is really the first kind of concerted effort to take a look at the relationship between religion and the brain of its kind. It's genuinely sort of a new project. So yeah, I'm going to talk about what we're doing here at NCU and kind of reflect on how, when studying something like religion, we really can't do it from a single disciplinary perspective. And also, in light of the sort of context of this talk, I'm also going to talk about the relationship between religion and health and how the study that we're doing has implications for that relationship. Okay, so there are a lot of places we could start when talking about the kind of history of the scientific study of religion, but I in general kind of like to start with these two fellows, these distinguished gentlemen from the 1800s. On our left, we have E.B. Tylor. He's a Victorian anthropologist, and Tylor proposed he's sort of the first one to think about the evolution of religion on a broad scale. And he proposed that religion was sort of primarily about the relationship between people and a variety of supernatural agents, be these gods, be this god, be it spirits, ghosts, or so on. And he proposed these beliefs, they arise as a way of coping with chaos and uncertainty in the world by seeing kind of agencies in our environment, by seeing agencies, by seeing things that happen maybe according to chance as the efforts of either benevolent or malevolent spirits, humans gain sort of a foothold in the world through which they can gain understanding. So this is one of the first systematic anthropomorphic theories of religion, or animist theories of religion. which is a line of thought that still continues to inspire evolutionary and cognitive theories of religion to this day. And in this line of thought, yeah, we're predisposed by evolution to detect agency, to see faces. Humans are such fundamentally social creatures that we tend to see faces all over the place. And some of these may end up becoming viewed as kind of spirits or gods with the will of agency of their own, giving rise to religiosity. But the guy on the right has a completely different perspective. This is Emile Durkheim, sort of one of the founding fathers of sociology, a French sociologist. And Durkheim thought that religion wasn't about supernatural beings or attempting to explain the world at all. Durkheim thought that religion primarily was about community. For Durkheim, when you undergo a religious ritual, it's a moment in which the community is gathering itself, setting aside the things that it values, and elevating them through ritual to kind of this higher place. So for Durkheim, things like God, important religious symbols, they don't have this kind of a external or exterior reality, even for the people within the system. They're symbols. They're symbols of how a group belongs to itself. It's the way the communities represent themselves to themselves. So this is a contrasting framework that informs, that is still something that we're grappling with today, even though their research is very old. You know, is religion primarily about what people think and what they believe? Or are we interested in religion because of all of the social effects it has? Are we interested in ritual because ritual is a way in which communities are built, and the beliefs on top are not as important? And as in every talk, when you present two options, you're going to take a third option that's better. So that's where we're going to be headed for that, spoiler alert. But yeah, and Durkheim, as I'm about to get into, Durkheim also was very interested in the way that religion and religious frameworks mediated health. So he wrote a very famous study looking at sort of mental health outcomes between Catholic and Protestant countries, and he found that Catholics had much better outcomes, which even though this study is outdated, it inspired a lot of thought. And his proposal was that in Catholic countries at the time, we're talking sort of turn of the 1800s into the 1900s, they had much better social solidarity networks due to sort of inherent ideas within Catholic culture. So this kind of for the last 100 years or so spurred a lot of thinking about this open question. And I say an open question because no one knows the answer to this. So what is the relationship between religion and well-being? So let's start with what we do know. It is very, very well established that religiosity in general leads to better health and psychological outcomes. It is such a strong association. They have done it with samples of thousands and thousands and thousands. They have done it testing a whole bunch of physiological, they've done it focusing on mortality, they've done it focusing on a bunch of sort of different health conditions. They've done a lot of work focusing on mental health. And religiosity, specifically service attendance, tends to be correlated with better health outcomes. This is an association that we know is true. Well, I shouldn't say know is true, we think is true. Now, obviously, people start asking questions. They're like, okay, well, if you can go to services, obviously you have a certain kind of vitality, you have a certain social belonging. But even when you control for baseline health, even when you control for age, even when you control for a bunch of factors, this correlation between religious attendance and positive health outcomes still remains really, really strong. So we know that that's a thing. People have done study after study after study demonstrating this. The thing we don't know is why. There was even a recent review by a scholar named Tyler Vanderpool, who studies sort of human flourishing is his big thing. So he writes a lot about religion and health. And yeah, he gets pretty fed up in this one review where he says, we literally don't need any more, he's talking about depression, we don't need any more studies looking for an association between religiosity and depression that isn't testing an hypothesis about the causal framework. We know that there's an association here, but what we don't know is why. So this is the next wave of research in religion and health, is digging into concrete, specific mechanisms to try to understand why we're seeing these positive associations. Now I'm going to talk maybe about some clues, some studies that I think kind of point some interesting paths. So this is a study done by an anthropologist who did a bunch of field work with Brazilian Pentecostals. Specifically in this study, he looked at two groups, the Assembly of God and the Universal Church of the Kingdom of God. So he constructed what we call in anthropology cultural consensus analysis. The way that you do this is that you pick something that's sort of a source of local knowledge. So in this case, based on interviews, he realized that the framework that people use to describe the ideal religious life or the ideal religious person is this notion of vida completa, the complete life. That's their term that they use for this. So we went around and he asked people, okay, list terms that to you mean a vida completa, that to you indicate that someone is living this kind of life. And then he asked everyone to rank those terms based on order of importance. So from that, he constructed a survey and then asked people to rate their own agreement with the items that he had developed from his free listing and from his sort of cultural analysis. So based on this, he got a pretty good measure of what he calls religious consonance, or how much people's beliefs are in line with the group that they're deeply embedded in, that they're a part of. And then he also gave them a bunch. He also he looked at sort of secular well-being, so like material well-being, social prestige, and then he took a bunch of sort of generalized psychological measures. And what he found was this really robust relationship between psychological well-being and religious consonance. And you can see in this figure from his paper that things like secular consonance, things like material well-being are not unimportant. They definitely have a bunch of impacts on psychological well-being, but this relationship tracks across all these sort of different levels of kind of economic and material well-being as well, where people who are very out of consonance with their group tend to have much higher levels of psychological distress. So what we learned from this, we can kind of, first of all, we can see that belonging is really important. Belonging to a group really matters, and that the more you kind of are in line, the more you belong to your group, you might have better mental health outcomes. But the other thing that's really, really important here is we see that belonging is very, very local. Belonging isn't going to mean the same thing in every context. Being religious isn't going to mean the same thing in every context. Being an ideal member of your group is going to vary by context. So we can see here that culture is going to play a really important factor in these studies, which brings me to sort of a next. This is summarizing a series of studies that the psychological anthropologist Tanya Luhrmann has done. So she's studied for years cross-cultural variations in models of the mind, and she's also studied cross-cultural variation in hallucination and what she calls sensory overrides. And what she's found is that states of consciousness and experience vary substantially and measurably across cultures. So what we sort of would treat as sort of a hallucinatory event or an extreme sort of spiritual experience, these things vary systematically within different cultural contexts. So that led her to ask why. And she became very interested in this because she found out she did this one 3-site study looking at schizophrenic or schizotypal people in the US, looking at them in Ghana and looking at them in India. And what she found was that people in Ghana and India had much better social and mental health outcomes than people in the United States, because within the cultural frameworks they're in, seeing things that aren't there, talking to people who aren't there isn't as heavily stigmatized as it is in the United States. We tend to have in spite of the fact the United States is very religious, in our everyday life, we tend to have a very sort of reality-centric model of the world, where things like talking to voices tend to really upset people and lead to people being more isolated. Whereas in some other contexts, due to their religious and spiritual beliefs, those things are treated a little more neutrally, and just that neutral treatment leads to very different outcomes. So she got very interested in this and she wanted to study it. And so she did this massive multi-site study working with psychologists and anthropologists. And what she narrowed it down to was this idea of porosity. So in different cultures, they have different ideas of where thoughts can come from and where the mind can go. So I would say that, probably most of us living in the US have a pretty non-porous model of the mind. We think of it as something that's just in our head. Our thoughts don't get communicated to other people except through things like language. But then they just sort of stay within the contents of our mind. But that's not true cross-culturally. Cross-culturally, there's a huge variation in how people think about the relationship between thoughts and reality. So cultures that have these higher levels of porosity, and so she sort of figured out a way to score this, have higher reports of spiritual incidences or sort of felt encounters with supernatural agents. Interestingly, though, there is some individual variation as well. It's called what she calls the absorption scale. Absorption just kind of refers to your ability to get lost in stimuli. So people who have really high absorption factors are, really good at being hypnotized. You're really good into going into kind of like flow states, things like that. It's something that varies just randomly amongst individuals. And that's also a major driver of why people have sort of these very distinct episodes of spiritual experience or encounters with sort of like felt agencies. So what this means is that people who are high absorption, who live in a high porosity culture, are going to have many more of these experiences in general than in the opposite situation. So we can see here that it's both the way in which our minds and brains vary on their own, just as a matter of genetics, as a matter of neurochemistry, as a matter of a whole bunch of things, and the way that culture sets up our expectations for the world. So when we're thinking about religiosity in the brain, it's always a biocultural study. We're always thinking about the way in which our brains and bodies are interacting with these social cultural environments and the way in which our social cultural environments are responding to the needs and to the tendencies of our brains and bodies. Okay, so what we're doing here at NCU is part of this larger cognitive neuroscience research agenda that I talked about. But the focus that we have is attachment to supernatural agents. So, we know from history, we know from anthropology, and we just know, most of us being people in the world, that humans over time and across basically every culture have developed intricate and emotional, powerful relationships with a variety of agents. These could be gods, these could be spirits, these could be angels, these could be saints, Buddhas. And then people also develop interesting relationships with threatening figures such as ghosts, demons, hungry ghosts in China, things like that. What's more, people also spend a lot of time figuring out how to cultivate these experiences. And they build spaces in which these experiences can be felt more often. They, spend lots of time sort of meditating on saints or, figuring out ways to visualize these entities. Or, also something very interesting to us from a neuroscientific perspective, people also engage in a lot of mind-altering practices, be these meditation, trance, or the use of psychoactives in order to come into some sort of dialogue with these unseen agencies. So the obvious question is why? I mean, we could just write this off, just say this is a thing that humans do, but as scientists, as people who want to pull this stuff apart, we're interested to know, okay, why is this such a strong cultural phenomenon? Why does this pop up again and again across all of these settings? So our approach is drawing on this larger framework within the psychology of religion that's rooted in a even larger psychological framework looking at human processes of attachment. So attachment theory posits that human beings, we have this innate psychobiological system that motivates us to seek proximity to significant others in times of need as a way of protecting ourselves from threats and alleviating distress. So the strongest first attachment figures for almost everyone tends to be their primary caregiver. And so our internal, as we are born and kind of nurtured by this relationship, be it positive or negative, that will create this model that will sort of structure the way in which we relate to individuals over the course of our lives. That's sort of our internal cognitive working model through which we form attachments with other people. And that's not to say that you're fixed, that these things change all the time, but the parental relationship tends to be very, very important. So the question is, okay, so we're talking about attachment, we're talking about attachment parents. What does God have to do with it? What do these supernatural agents have to do with it? Well, psychologists began to notice that for religious believers, especially the devout, God functions as this important source of attachment. Religious texts, religious teachings will often ascribe a lot of parental traits to God or to the gods, either punishing or benevolent, nourishing and protective. In addition, sort of following this initial definition of attachment being kind of a solution to crisis, God is often sought out in times of crisis and need. And for people who really feel this in a very kind of deep way, they can be a real source of resilience for them in hard times. They can have kind of this, they can be a well of kind of psychological need. So currently the kind of theory of attachment to God has kind of focused on these two pathways. It's worth noting that these are not competing hypotheses. These are just sort of two different ways in which we think people develop a strong attachment to a supernatural agent. So the first is called the correspondence hypothesis. In this framework, people who grow up in a stable household, they develop a concept of God as secure and benevolent. Their parents are secure and benevolent. They just kind of will map that belief onto the figure of God. I should mention this is individuals who grow up in religious households, because people tend to copy their parents' religion statistically in general. So people who grow up in religious households that are very stable, that are very nurturing, will just tend to kind of give all of those traits to their concept of God. They'll have this very kind of secure, benevolent sense of attachment to this kind of like supernatural figure. The second pathway is what people have called the compensation hypothesis. So in these cases, people who come from deeply unstable environments, who have gone through some kind of trauma, or who are experiencing an episode of instability, may become strongly attached to a being like God as a stabilizing influence for them psychologically. So this is where you see your people who have a conversion experience, you know, in their middle age, or like at a really distinct point in life. Maybe they weren't religious, or they weren't sort of part of a religious group for most of their life, and then almost like a switch flips and they suddenly become very, very devoutly religious. These people tend to have this kind of they tend to have an insecure attachment style, and they tend to also have this very sort of strong relationship to this kind of new mental model of the divine. So these are two pathways. There's probably more, but these are the two that the research is focused on, since they kind of nicely map on to also sort of secure attachment and insecure attachment. It also matters what the God or what God looks like. So I chose these images because these are both images of the same Buddhist bodhisattva deity, and Manjurshi, who's the bodhisattva of wisdom. And on the left is, you know, just him in meditations, just sort of manifesting wisdom. But on the right is his theorist form. It's Manjurshi is the I can't remember the name of his theorist form. It's on the tip of my tongue, so I'm not going to try to search for it. But yeah, he can also take on this sort of ferocious, terrifying agency. And this is true of a lot of supernatural agents. You know, in Hinduism, there are gods who are both benevolent and destroyers. And obviously in Christianity, you have both benevolent God and punishing God. In all the Abrahamic traditions, you have this kind of dichotomy. So people have also kind of looked into this and tried to pick it apart a little. In particular, there's been two interesting studies by a psychologist named Katherine Johnson. In her first study, she and her team, they primed people with different images of God, one that was more benevolent, one that was authoritarian and punishing, and the other was just kind of neutral. It was sort of a general mystical idea. What they found was, and then they sort of had people play kind of a cooperation game, or where they were given the option to kind of like share money with people or to punish people for defecting. And what they found was that people who were primed with an authoritarian God tended to be much more aggressive, and they had decreased levels of pro-social behavior. Whereas people who were primed with a benevolent God showed decreased rates of aggression. They also had increased sort of levels of pro-sociality, and they're also more likely to endorse actions like forgiveness and volunteerism. So this isn't to say that people just have one or the other in their head all the time. Like, people can have very complex constructs, but there does seem to be different kind of modes of these supernatural agents can also prime different kinds of behavior. And they did a follow-up study where they did more of a scale, where they kind of had people rate adjectives of God. And there they found that people who tended to have more benevolent conception of God scored much higher on other psychological measures of agreeableness and conscientiousness. So there seems to be something at play in this underlying concept. It's not just, you know, one size fits all. The content of the representation matters. Okay. So now we can talk about dreaming. This is my parents' talk. You can see on the right that when she's sleeping, and she is asleep in that photo, even with her eye open, her paws twitch and her eyes are slightly open, which is critical to how we think about dreaming, actually. So talking about attachment, so, dreaming is a universal human phenomenon, and we're actually kind of living in the golden age of dream research. There's been so much progress in the last couple of decades that we're sort of entering this new era of trying to understand what dreams are. For a shocking amount of time, psychologists and neuroscientists, sort of leaving aside the psychoanalytic kind of Freudian people, just thought the dreams were nonsense. They were just things the brain does, but they weren't, relevant, they weren't important, didn't need to be studied. I mean, I know that that's pretty much completely wrong. So systematic dream research has found the dream content accurately corresponds with our waking concerns. They've done tests where experienced dream researchers have gotten a completely blind dream journal from someone, and they've been able to figure out, okay, I think I know what gender this person is. I think I know what country they're from. I can tell you things about their sort of familial composition. I can tell you what kind of line of work they're in. It's just our dreams actually, even though to us, an individual dream episode seems, so fanciful as to be nonsensical, dreams in general kind of reliably track where we're at. So the theory that our research group identifies with, which I should, for scientific integrity say is not the only one, we're simulationists. So we think that we have a functional view of dreaming as a kind of simulation space in which the brain is trying out a bunch of different approaches to everyday problems. So, in the case of your dog, when your dog is, kicking as it's sleeping, we think that that's kind of a level of, it's the brain kind of rehearsing, it's practicing different scenarios in which it might be engaged in a behavior like play or hunting or something like that. But for humans in particular, dreaming is amazingly social. Dreams are very, very overpopulated. Dream researchers on humans have known this for a long time. They tend to almost always have at least one person in them. Usually they have multiple people in them. And sometimes they're things people know, sometimes they're things people don't know. So we think that dreaming, in addition to being kind of simulations in a simulation space, are also where the brain tests out and kind of models and thinks through social relationships in particular. Dreaming is where our minds, our brains kind of think about, different combinations of things. They process a relationship to important others. And it's worth noting too that all of this is part of a larger framework in neuroscience in which we've called predictive processing, in which we don't treat the brain as kind of a passive receiver, but something that's much more active. So your brain is always trying to be one step ahead of reality. It's trying to, test hypotheses constantly to figure out what's going on. It's not just sitting there waiting for input. It's very actively engaging and kind of probing the world to figure out what's happening so it can kind of keep you on track. Social network analysis of dreaming, looking at characters, has found that they tend to cluster around our core support network. They tend to cluster around our close relationships. Sometimes they tend to co-occur with people who are from similar domains in our lives. So there's this very famous dream series called the Barb Sanders series about a woman who kept very meticulous dream journals and just gave them to these researchers. And they found that she would often dream about her ex-boyfriends together, even if they were people who had never met in real life, because they're sort of a similar domain of her experience and of her kind of relational profile. So so our dreams, they're simulated. We think that they're simulating, they're kind of testing out, they're helping us figure out what's going on in our social lives. And this figure is from a study that came out this year, where they put people in seclusion and then looked at the incidence of social interactions within their dreams. And as you can see, what they found is that it pretty much stays almost exactly the same. Like being completely away from people still led to frequent dreaming about others. So if dreams were just modeling what's going on in our lives on an everyday, seclusion should weed that out, but it didn't weed it out at all. It seems pretty reliable that our dreams are just sort of fundamentally social. So on supernatural agents, the one of Dr. McNamara, the PI of this project, one of his specialties is research on dreaming and especially research on nightmares. And so one thing that he's found in previous studies is that a key trigger for dreaming about supernatural agents is a sense of sort of lack of control or elevated stress levels in dreams. That's when these kind of threatening figures tend to develop supernatural characteristics. Is when they go from being normal to having, exaggerated physical characteristics, or, a person sort of transforms into a demon or something like that. So there also seems to be an element in which stress and a lack of control also sort of furnishes these sensations and experiences that feel very bizarre and supernatural. That's not to say that, we think that dreaming is primarily about sort of, sorry, let me take a step back. There are plenty of times when people have positive religious dreams as well, especially for believers. They will positively dream about angels. A really, really common occurrence is people dreaming about people who have recently died, often having very positive experiences from those dreams. We think that dreaming is just sort of a major vector through which people engage with supernatural agents of a huge variety. And this, again, is where culture plays a major factor. If you have a dream about your, friend who just passed away, and it's very vivid and it's very engaged, when you wake up the next morning, you're probably going to talk to the people around you. And if they're, if you're in a cultural environment that believes in an afterlife, that believes that the afterlife is accessible through things like dreaming, you're going to sort of develop a concept that you had this kind of tangible interaction with a person who has passed on. If you're in a cultural framework where no one believes that kind of thing, they might say, oh, that's an interesting dream, but then you wouldn't maybe continue. It wouldn't go on within your own mental life as an important sort of experience for you. It might not be as kind of viable. So again, we're always sort of interplaying between culture and sort of natural biology. Okay, I'm actually gonna skim over this just because I want to get to the other stuff. This is just a recent review. One of the things that we know, the brain, one of the brain networks that seems to be very keenly involved in religious cognition is the mentalizing network. So the same things that light up when you're interacting, when you're trying to project to other people, when you're trying to think about what they're thinking, tend to light up when people do things like pray. So there was a study from about a decade ago, but that's been replicated a couple times, where they found that when people are engaging in prayer, the same parts of the brain light up as they do when they're sort of talking to or interacting with someone they know, who they're trying to understand their mental state of. So our sort of normal social cognition also comes into play when we're thinking about supernatural agents, especially for people who have very vivid concepts like religious believers. Okay, so briefly, we're just going to talk about the NCU study that we're currently planning out. So we have a longitudinal design. We're collecting daily data for 2 weeks on about 150 subjects. We're first taking a bunch of baseline measures, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. And then after they finish the baseline measures, then they basically do 2 weeks where they do daily diaries and dream diaries. So at night, they tell us kind of what they did that day. They rate their emotional mood. They rate their closeness to God. And then they get primed with either an insecure attachment prime, where they talk about either God or an important person in their life not sort of coming through for them at a key moment, or they get primed with a secure attachment prime, where they talk about a moment of need where someone did come true for them. And those are randomized to sort of look at the different relationships of these priming. And then, an important subgroup is going to get these dream headbands, which I'm going to talk about briefly. So the dream headband is a wearable, pretty straightforward, commercially available EEG headset that integrates with your phone. They have an app and everything. And it's very, very good at measuring different types of dream states. So it has, I don't want to get too deep into that, but it's very good at telling us, okay, when was this person in REM sleep? When were they in what we call NREM sleep? Were they, in a consistent sort of stream of REM, or like, was their sleep very disorganized? Was it scattered? Were they waking during the night? And then it also tells us some details about, okay, were they having what we call, alpha and beta waves? If they are, they're probably awake. Or are they having kind of theta, which is an interesting middle point in between sleeping and waking that indicates they're processing a lot of information. So we'll have that information, and then we can correlate that with the things we're seeing in their dream diaries and their sort of ratings of their attachment to God or whatever important supernatural agent is viable for them. So for our baseline, we're gathering information. We're doing the big five, which is a just sort of set of well-validated measures in psychology, looking at different aspects of personality, doing the attachment inventory, which should tell us about their attachment styles. We're asking them about their core social network, and also, how those people know each other. Who do you get the most support from, which should tell us, okay, what's the composition of these people's core social networks? Is it very dense, where everyone they know knows each other and, financially and socially supports each other? Or are they in a very loose social network, which will kind of also correlate probably with their attachment style? So baseline, just depression, anxiety, and stress. And then we're looking at REM behavior disorder as a baseline, which then we can compare against the reports they get us from from the 2-week data collection part of the study. Our religiosity measures, we're using a scale that looks at things like religious coping, that looks at things like donation to your religious organization, frequency of service attendance, self-ratings, religiosity, and spirituality. We're also using this thing called the CRED scale, which looks at which is based on the theory that people whose parents had a more kind of expressive religiosity tend to grow up to be more religious. We're using this SLAMB, which is looking at different aspects of God. You saw the A and the B, you saw before, authoritarian, benevolent. The other components are limitless, mystical, and ineffable. So kind of trying to capture, especially people who might be spiritual and not religious. So they might have a mystical sense of God or the divine, but not a really sort of agency sense of one. And then this revised paranormal belief scale, which sort of gets to that ferocity question that I raised earlier, thinking that, people who believe that a lot of sort of like telepathic or kind of strange paranormal things are possible are probably going to have a very different relationship with their dreaming than people who don't. This is a dream headband. It has 3 sensors on the front and 2 on the back. I think this image here cut off, but yeah, you can see on the back. This is just details about it. It's a dry EEG electrode. It analyzes in real time, and then it updates things to a database. So it'll just sort of analyze every night. They click a thing on their phone that starts them for the night, and they click something when it's done, and then it comes through to us, and we can see, the quality of the data we're getting, as well as get the data from them. And then, yeah, it's kind of a validation material. So the PSG on the left is from a kind of full spectrum EEG helmet. And these are the sensors that you can see the kind of dream sensors are below them, which just indicates that at least for the sensors it has, it's doing a very good job. And then it also, this is sort of their classifying algorithms on bottom. It also matches the accuracy of what a full helmet would give you in a sleep study with this sort of smaller wearable technology. So yeah, this is just an overview of the data collection process. Part of the reason we're excited about this, wearables are kind of a brand new field in neuroscience technology. It's really only been in the last few years that it's become viable to do a study like this. And our hope is that we can look at things in a more naturalistic environment. Labs, much as I love them, are just so artificial that it's hard to say that a lot of the things we're doing are really capturing what people might be like out in the world. So we're hoping with this project, even though we're very focused on dreams, it sort of will be like starting a new wave of trying to really capture what's going on in people's minds when they're out kind of living their lives in the world rather than just doing everything in the lab. And yeah, that's my spiel.
Well, there are a lot of questions in the chat. So
okay, great.
to my student colleagues, Veronica and Tabitha, I guess we can just go one at a time. We can rotate through. The first was, what is your definition of religion? Is it self-chosen? And then it says in parentheses, the subject says they are religious.
Yeah, so this is a great question and kind of a classic problem in the study of religion, both historical, anthropological, and scientific. So we, for the purposes of this study, are defining religion as having the belief in religiosity, as having the belief in a relationship with some kind of supernatural agent. Now, supernatural is a very weighted term because it varies a lot cross-culturally. But by supernatural, we just mean something unseen, something unverifiable by sort of regular cognition, something that takes extraordinary cognition like dreaming or mystical states or sort of what people feel in prayer in order to be in contact with it. That is not the only definition, and there's a lot of sociologists who would hate that definition. So this is one of those things in research where you kind of just have to set out you have to operationalize what you're doing, and then just kind of set out and proceed along that, documenting as you go, because there's so many different paths that you could take. In this case, also, I mean, the Lambie scale that we're using, we're casting a pretty wide net. We're not looking for people who are just religious in a certain way. So that's why we have so many different measures, asking about things like service attendance, asking about things like, okay, do you have a mystical sense of the divine? Maybe that's not personified. Do you have a more like authoritarian sense? Hoping that we're kind of getting at a whole bunch of ways to be kind of religious and spiritual and not just sort of a single one. But, no approach is ever going to be kind of complete.
Yeah, it's the operational part that I found like would be really, I've been studying this for a while, and getting an operational definition of what religion is so difficult. It's so hard to know if that's what you're actually measuring.
Oh, yeah.
How did you get to the point of deciding that dreams were going to be your, maybe not operational definition, but your temporary definition? How did you get to that? How did you go from, I understand looking for a definition is difficult. How did you get to dreams?
Yeah, so dreams are really interesting because So this is where, cultural definitions of religion are very important, where in a highly secularized society like our own, religion tends to be like, okay, here's waking everyday cognition, and religion and spirituality is everything else. It's sort of just everything over there. And so because that's the dynamic in which a lot of because this is an American study, a lot of people live their lives, dreams are still this area where, people who are hardcore rationalists, you start talking to them about their dreams and they kind of open up. Like everyone dreams, right? And dreams are a weird experience that doesn't usually fit in kind of these boxes that we normally think of. So dreaming kind of remains, another interesting area that is actually growing in study is, studying kind of like psychedelics in labs and stuff like that. But that's something that's so particularized that takes a certain personality who's going to be drawn to that. Dreams are universal. So there's two components. One, because they're universal, we can recruit a lot more subjects. And also we think because they're universal, the more we learn about dreams, that teaches us something about humans in general, to the extent that we can learn about humans in general and their religiosity. But yeah, dreaming is just, I think, it's just one of those areas that is not part of everyday consciousness. So it tends to evoke a lot of religion and spiritual talk, even for people who wouldn't consider themselves religious or spiritual.
Awesome. We have another question in the chat and I also have something to piggyback off of that, but I'll hold my question. I'll get to the questions in the chat. But are there examples of case studies where an individual with a non-porous mind experiences something that is perceived as external?
Good question. I'm not sure that I know the answer to that specifically. What I would say is that so porosity is the cultural variable. Absorption is the individual variable. And there are a lot of different things that can cause someone to score higher on absorption. But But I mean, yeah, I would say certainly when we're talking about these things, we're talking about averages. So it's certainly possible that people who don't score high on absorption, who live in a very non-porous setting, experience things that are perceived as external. I should say there's been a great deal of attention given to people who have epileptic tendencies, because they tend to have very idiosyncratic, interesting spiritual profiles. We sort of moved off of that as the neuroscience religion community, just because it's such a small, distinct group. But yeah, there are plenty of different ways in which your brain chemistry can give you all sorts of different experiences that might not just be captured in this single absorption variable.
Okay. So I guess I'll piggyback off of that at this point then. Have you guys noticed anything thus far within your study? I know it's fairly young along, but anything related, I know you touched on this, around health outcomes and religion?
So yeah, I mean, we are still, we haven't started collecting data yet, but I mean, we are very interested in that. And I will say in general, yeah, like religiosity is, as I sort of said at the beginning, it is very strongly correlated with better health outcomes. Although again, it's a very vexed field because there's just so much different research going on and no one really quite knows why that's happening. But it does seem that, yeah, people who tend to attend services a lot, who tend to be very religious in general, right? Again, we're talking big statistical means, tend to have higher, better health outcomes.
Just in general practice and day-to-day, work life, you have individuals who, oppose and or agree to certain, health treatments based on their religious beliefs. So I didn't know if that's something you guys are looking at in your current study at this time. And I note that, I know time is of the essence, but we have Natalia and other questions in the chat. I won't hold you with that, John, but that's just something that kind of, spurred out. Yeah.
Oh, just to briefly respond. Yeah, I mean, we're not really focused on that because we're more interested in the kind of cognitive elements, but the religion and public health field is very interested in those kinds of questions. And what they've found is that often there's been a lot of research on this, like especially looking at cultures that even have higher levels of religiosity in the United States. Like there's been a lot of research on this in like Africa, in various parts of Africa, and various parts of Asia. And what they found is that partnering with the local religious authorities is often a key component in transforming kind of big health outcomes. Like there's a public health scientist called Ellen Eidler, who she talks about how dealing with the, oh my gosh, I'm blanking. It was the epidemic before COVID. It was in Africa for a minute. Ebola, dealing with Ebola in Africa, the real turning point in that pandemic from a public health standpoint was when the religious authorities and the public health people started working together. So that's definitely like, these things are all happening in these sort of very layered systems of, belief and affiliation and trust. So yeah, it's definitely always important.
Awesome. So a follow-up here from Stephen is there something that we as participants can contribute, participate, or help your institution?
Yes, I mean,
a few questions about that is how can we participate, or what can we do to be part of this?
Yeah, so I mean, we are recruiting broadly. Our recruitment emails will go out sometime in the next month, and we're especially interested in recruiting from NCU students. So if you want to just be a participant and you're interested in going through, it's definitely going to be an option. We're not fully set up for it yet, but I know down the line we're interested in recruiting more research assistants and getting more people involved. I know that we're probably starting that process with people in the Department of Psychology, just to kind of keep it open to that. But I think we would be interested in also expanding out. So there will also be opportunities in that area as well, because we're going to be collecting a lot of data, and we're hoping also that this will be a jumping off point to do additional studies as well. So hopefully we're very excited to be doing this, but it might even be something that will grow over the next few years.
John, they are asking if there's any exclusionary criteria. I don't know how much detail you want to go into now, but that is in the chat.
Sure. The exclusion criteria right now is just being an adult, which everyone is, so that's easy. And you do have to have a stable Wi-Fi connection in your house, just because the headbands update automatically, and they don't have enough storage space to hold all the information. So that's a key component as well. But I imagine most NCU students, because of the nature of the university, have good stuff like that. We are, based on the baseline survey, there are certain things that we're screening out just out of larger concerns, which I can't really get into, but in general, where our exclusion criteria is pretty light.
So then it sounds like going to those questions about participating, then to kind of look for the NCU emails, if there's any invitations that we're doing this, and so then please join us, or maybe if they want to contact you specifically to say, hey, I'm interested in either participating or volunteering or doing something that is part of your project. Would you agree with that?
Definitely. Yeah, you can definitely contact me at my NCU email if you're interested in participating. That would be great.
Awesome.
John, one other element that they asked about was, are the measures available for the participants here, the attendees here this evening, to take and read and review, or are they not?
That's an interesting question. I mean, all of them are available. I mean, all of them are drawn from different studies. We're trying to use well-validated scales. So, all the ones that I mentioned are out there somewhere. They all have papers associated with them. We will be putting them all on. We're using so our funding agency is very interested in us taking a very open science approach. So we will be putting some of the stuff on what's called the Open Science Framework, but all that's still under construction. So I would say yes down the line, but just not yet. We also are still internally kicking around. We like the scales we have, but we're also kicking around a couple others. So it's on the verge of being finalized.
Tabitha, I don't know if you're going to take the next one, but there's a pretty straightforward question in here wanting to know, how comfortable is the Dream headband?
Yeah.
One of our colleagues here says they struggle with wearing jewelry when sleeping.
Yeah, it's not bad. I've worn it. I have one. Yeah, it just kind of depends on your own sleeping habits. It works pretty well. They've tested it pretty thoroughly to make it comfortable, but it does have to be, tight enough on you that the sensors are on you without being uncomfortable. We are giving out like a sweatband with it for people who need just sort of an additional thing so that it can rest more comfortably. But yeah, I think they're pretty comfortable, but it's a very problem with that is that it's a subjective question.
I think I wanted to just tap in. I saw Natalia. She had her hand up. If in fact she wanted to still chime in, we would welcome that, Natalia.
Tabitha, if she's not able to join in, there's a couple of other questions there. One is, what are the theories associated with your study? And then the other question that you may want to eventually transition to is, has anyone in the study mentioned the role of the Holy Spirit?
I don't think that's, but yes.
Yeah.
That's fine.
So as far as theories, it's kind of there are many theories embedded in this study. All science is theory upon theory. I would say our main framework is the attachment theory, which is not the only way that people do cognitive science religion or even neuroscience religion, but we're very focused on because the attachment to God stuff has some very compelling research, and that attachment in general sort of situates us within a larger stream of psychological research. So I'd say the predominant theory is looking at how people's concepts of attachments or their attachment mediates a whole bunch of other relational and kind of social outcomes. So I would say one name you could give this is that's coming from the attachment literature is it's theistic relational spirituality. So it's both theistic, it's agent oriented, and it's relational. We're not just sort of dealing, these are things that we're interested in how people have these ongoing processes and connections, not just to how they kind of experience it in a vacuum.
Mm-hmm.
And then, sorry, what was there was another question on top of that. Oh, no, the Holy Spirit. So again, we haven't started gathering data, but that is absolutely why we're including so many items on our sort of concept of God scale, because research has shown again and again that people have very diverse God concepts. They tend to be drawn to a particular one, like people tend to have a favorite, but research on sort of Christian representation of God has shown that, these are the representation of God, Jesus, Holy Spirit are very different cognitively, and they sort of correspond to different, traits people will associate with each vary, and they will also associate with, you ask them attachment questions, like, what do you think is going to help you in this situation? That will vary too, based on how they're representing this. So there's massive complexity in the way that people process all this information. It's not, belief is not sort of an on-off function.
There's one other question, John. You mentioned processing. Are we including cognitive function of reward and punishment processing?
Yeah, I'd say predictive processing is even more ambitious than that. So in the, I'm trying to think of the fastest way to say this. Basically, in predictive processing, rather than neurons kind of affecting the level above them that's more organized, it's a reverse view of the brain. So the highest organized parts of the brain are regulating everything beneath them. So it's really actually kind of against a behaviorist model that just says, okay, you get rewarded in certain ways, and that sort of, causes you to behave more in that way, or you get punished in certain ways, so that just sort of this kind of cause and effect behaviorism. Instead, it's really thinking that the brain is always kind of directing your attention towards what's next. It's always trying. The world that you're in is being predicted by your brain. It's not as, I don't know if this is answering this question very well, but anyway, I think the short answer is no, that's not really our framework. I think reward and punishment are a little too abstract for us. We're kind of more interested in the larger kind of predictive perspective.
Yes, Dr. Batch, you're answering the question. I'm sorry, this is Tim Willis in Kansas City. I'm asking those questions about reward and punishment processing because I'm interested in that, the cognitive behavior of recidivism and or theories associated with this.
Totally.
So I do understand and appreciate. Thank you very much.
I would say predictive processing is very interested in the distinction between model-based and model-free learning. So in model-free learning is something you do without having a cognitive representation of it in your head. But, and so those are sort of the two ways in which we interact with the world. We either learn to do it kind of in this very direct, interactive way, or we build a mental model. Think of it as like solving a maze through just going right or left every time you're in the maze, or having kind of a larger model of it in your head that you're using to navigate your way out. So the thing is that when we're talking about religion, we're talking about such a high order cognitive concept that we're really only in the model-based world. We're much less in the kind of model-free world.
And I want to get Meg. I see Meg here has her hand up. Meg, if you can unmute.
So I've been trying to think about an operational definition for religion because I looked at the Baylor survey and it's all self-report, which apparently that's where you're at too.
Oh yeah.
And I had this idea. I don't know if you've heard the philosopher Kierkegaard, but he was the first existential philosopher, and he had this idea about religion that's really interesting. He thought that there were two kinds of religious people. there were what he called pagan Christians, not putting them down, just calling them pagan Christians, because they wanted to do things like go back in the day and touch the hem of Jesus' garment, that kind of thinking. Way more like Dionysus, where you would, I don't know if you know, but if you touch Dionysus, you get a nice, pleasurable experience in ancient pagan religions. But then Kierkegaard thought, if that person thinks that way, they're not Christians, because Jesus isn't back there. The whole point of the story is that he didn't die. And he's still alive. He's around right now. So I had the thought that if you could sneak that question some way in a survey, so that you could know which kind, now it only works with one kind of religion, obviously. Right. But some question like that, I don't know what the question would be. It would at least give you an operational separation between people who had, I guess you would call it, a fundamentalist kind of thinking about religion. And so that's not where you seem to be headed at the beginning of this talk, something that's outside, something supernatural. And then if they answered the question another way, you would know they really do have a leaning toward something that is truly supernatural. Whereas if you just say, are you a Christian? You're not going to get that answer. And I just was trying to figure out sneaky ways to ask that question so you could, divide up your samples. Maybe not this particular study. I don't know.
Yeah.
I mean, this particular dream study, because that's a really interesting break.
Yeah, I would say a couple things. One, I would say, I think that's a very Protestant way of thinking about religiosity. I think the Catholics would object strongly. And so that in our efforts to be ecumenical, I think that we're trying, but also I do really think that this Lambie scale, which asks about different adjectives of God, I mean, a lot of those adjectives are like ineffable, limitless, unknowable, mystical. So I really think that will give us interesting profiles, because we are just asking about affiliation. But we know from sociological research, there are people who are very self-aware that when they say they identify as this, that, or the other religion, they only identify as that because they really enjoy being part of a community, but the religiosity of it isn't very interesting to them. And so we're hoping that our scales will sort of get that kind of thing. So we're asking them to self-identify, but then we ask about a lot of different kinds of religious behaviors. So we're sort of trying to hope that when we look at it as a composite, we're going to see some interesting variations. But yeah, I think these are classic issues in the study of religion. The sort of anthropomorphic versus non-anthropomorphic is a divide within religions themselves. So these are just the things you have to grapple with.
John, I'm going to go ahead and jump in. Clearly, there is a tremendous amount of interest and appreciation for this topic. I think this could go on easily for another half hour or hour, but we are beyond our time. And I want to thank you and everyone for joining. I think in closing, you've seen quite a busy chat this evening off to the right, including, John, inquiries about will we be able to get status updates on how the study is evolving and what it is you all are learning. So for the group's benefit as well as yours, please know those of us that are student facilitators will take that back to the IPE committee.
Yeah,
and we will talk about opportunities and potential logistics as to how to accomplish that. So the comments are just flooding the chat, John, with gratitude and appreciation for this very important topic and scope of study. So thank you so much for joining us here this evening.
Thank you guys so much.
Yeah, and thank you everybody else for participating, and we wish you all a great evening and a great rest of the day.
Right. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.